Hey, so thanks for tuning in. I am here to talk just a little bit about art history, not so much in the traditional sense with dates and movements or in a linear way necessarily, but through telling stories and anecdotes and more along the lines to get us to start thinking about what art is. So let's begin here. Before there was art, there was philosophy, and philosophers have a great deal to say about the nature of art and the aesthetic response. And when we talk about philosophy, we must start by talking about the big three in Greek philosophy of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And today we'll mostly be touching on Plato's view of what art is, but we will begin first by looking at a painting that features Socrates. So here in this painting, we see Death of Socrates by Jacques Louis David. We see Socrates accused by the Athenian government of having denied the gods and corrupting the youth. He is given the choice of surrendering his beliefs or dying by drinking a cup of hemlock. And his disciples surround him. They're all bidding him a very dramatic and emotional farewell. The old man in the robe sits upright in the bed, one hand reaching over the cup and the other gesturing up in the air. And he's continuing his discourse on the immortality of the soul, despite all that's going on around him. He's surrounded by students who are all showing emotional distress, and almost every single one of them is looking away as none of them can bear to witness the act that is to follow. And each disciple is expressing all the stages of grief. At the foot of his bed sits his esteemed student, Plato. And now there are many historical inaccuracies and many artistic liberty that David took in painting this painting. One such example is that Plato would have been a much younger man at this time, but he's depicted as an aging old man, much like his teacher Socrates. And another discrepancy is that Socrates himself was reported to have been much older and unsightly at the time of his death. But here he's depicted as a strong and sturdy, and I think kind of a handsome figure. This is a bust of Socrates, by the way. Um, the painting we just looked at was from 1787, when moralizing themes were popular in the period preceding and leading up to and following the French Revolution. I know we said we would talk about Plato, but I'm going to digress just a little bit. This is Liberty Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix, and he came a little bit after David. And in this painting, the artist is depicting an event from the July Revolution of 1830, which was a prelude to the June Rebellion of 1832, as depicted in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, just to give you a little context. Anyway, back to this painting. We see a young woman of the people personifying the concept and the goddess of liberty is leading the people forward and over the bodies of the fallen fighters while holding the French flag. This innovative work is a symbol of liberty, but when it was first revealed to the public, it was actually rejected by artists and critics as what was embraced during that time were classical representations of reality. And this painting, if you were to look at it very closely, perhaps in real life, it reveals the underarm hair of the young woman, which was considered vulgar by classical artists who proclaimed that a goddess's skin should be smooth and flawless. Anyway, late 18th century, early 19th century paintings and moralizing themes. These are more of David's paintings, which are more specifically associated with concepts of civic virtue, self sacrifice, devotion to duty, and stoic austerity. More David. Back to this painting. Anyway, to get to the philosophy of things, for Plato, visual art could be broken down into two components, mimesis and techne, which are Greek words for imitation and skill. For Plato, beauty was a separate idea and an essential ideal that expressed the truth of things, and beauty and truth, in Plato's view, were of a much higher order than art. Plato actually had very little interest in visual art because art, in his view, were neither a useful imitation of these essential ideas, nor were they the ideas themselves. He criticized that all imitations, also known as art, for failing to depict the eternal ideal realities. Take the example of René Magritte's The Betrayal of Images, also known as The Treachery of Images, It is a painting of a pipe, and beneath it, it reads in French, "This is not a pipe." Just a little bit about Magritte. He is a well-known Belgian surrealist painter who rendered commonplace things in unfamiliar ways. He depicted the familiar and juxtaposed them in a slightly disturbing and strange way, posing questions about the nature of representation and reality. So naturally, he's a good artist to look at for when we're talking about Plato. According to Plato, there would be, in the world of ideas, an essence of perfect pipeness. A pipe in the real world might be useful, but would lack the perfection of the ideal pipe. And the painted image of the pipe, however, is neither useful nor ideal, as implied by Magritte's written text. He said, "The famous pipe, how people reproached me for it, and yet, could you stuff my pipe? No, it is just a representation, is it not? So if I had written on my picture, 'This is a pipe,' I would have been lying." So for Plato, the image, this painting, is the least true of the three conditions. Aristotle, who was Plato's student, his position allowed for more possibilities than Plato's ideas on art. Even though he followed Plato in the basic conception of art as a combination of mimesis and technique, he didn't restrict it to the exact or essential copy of something. He argued that imitation is something natural that humans enjoy from an early age and that we can even learn from. Whereas Plato dismissed the artists because he considered their images to be distractions from the truth, Aristotle believed in the power of art to repair the shortcomings in nature. He believed that art had the potential to be the route to knowledge. So from the days of Plato and Aristotle right up to the present day, there has been an abundance of philosophical issues that have addressed and debated the question of what is art? So we'll start here. In the early 20th century, the American photographer Edward Steichen, who was a painter by training but then became a photographer that changed fashion photography forever, he purchased Brancusi's sleek bronze sculpture called Bird in Space. A little digression, this is some Steichen photographs. Anyway, Steichen had purchased the sculpture in France, and on his return to the United States, he declared the work to customs as an original work of art, which in American law are exempt from import duty. However, to qualify as a sculpture, works had to be reproductions by carving or casting, imitations of natural objects, chiefly of the human form. So because the bird didn't look like this, nor this, it was classified as a utilitarian object by the American Customs Office. This was in 1926, almost 100 years ago. The bird, it was decided, was not art. And instead, it entered the country under the category of kitchen utensils and hospital supplies, and Steichen had to pay $600 in tax on the spot. So, with the help of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the American sculptor and the founder of the Whitney Museum, Steichen sued. This is the old Whitney Museum, which has then become a part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and now is currently housing the collection from the Frick collection while it undergoes renovation. And this is the new Whitney Museum. This painting of Whitney, by the way, was painted in 1916 when most American women had long hair and wore long skirts or dresses, but here Whitney has short hair and is wearing pants, and it's said that her husband would not allow them to hang this painting in their home because she was depicted wearing pants, so instead she hung it in her studio. So this Brancusi versus US trial revolved around the nature of what art is. conservatives defended the Platonic view that art had to reflect skill and technique and were perplexed as to why the bird had no bird-like features like a head or feet or wings. In other words, to the conservatives, the bird was neither an accurate imitation of nature nor the product of a skilled technician. On the other hand, the modernists felt that Brancusi had captured the very essence of a bird suspended in space. They felt the form expressed qualities of birdness as perceived by the artist, and they even argued that the polished surface of the form evoked the glimmer of the sun. The modernist's biggest argument was that Brancusi, the artist himself, had called his sculpture a bird, which was in and of itself sufficient evidence that it was indeed a bird. So this position approximates Aristotle's view of art as originating in the perceptions of the artist. So on this particular occasion, the modernist prevailed, and the court ruled in Steichen's favor. Brancusi's bird was declared a work of art, and the judge stated, "It has the suggestion of flight. It suggests grace, aspiration, vigor, coupled with speed in the spirit of strength, potency, beauty, just as a bird does." So ultimately, the court was persuaded that its definition of what constituted art was out of date. You can see that Brancusi's work is very much influenced by some African sculptures, much like his contemporaries Picasso and Modigliani, which we'll get to in a minute. That's Brancusi in his studio. Some Picasso, which we'll get back to. But first, Modigliani. This is a self-portrait by Modigliani, who became the epitome of the tragic artist, whose legend of a deteriorating life is almost as well known as that of Vincent van Gogh, which I think you're familiar with, but if not, here are some of his paintings. Anyway, within a few years of arriving in Paris as a young, dapper academic artist, Modigliani transformed into a voracious drinker and drug addict, and he contracts tuberculosis and deteriorates rapidly into a sort of prince of vagabonds. And Modigliani endured impoverishment well into his final hours, and he was known to exchange works of art for meals at restaurants. One of the main ironies of Modigliani's work was that for a person living such a tortured life that he could produce such serene and beautiful work. The French poet Jean Cocteau called Modigliani the simplest and noblest genius of that heroic age. The women he depicts are strong and defiant, unapologetic and serene. This is a portrait of Gertrude Stein by Pablo Picasso, and it's a well-known story that when Picasso began to paint this portrait, he was fascinated by her appearance, and Gertrude Stein claims she sat for him 90 times before finally he gave up. And at that point, he takes a break to travel, whereupon he encounters Iberian sculptures and discovers in those works facets and planes and disjointedness that triggers a whole new approach of painting for him. So you can see the African mask influence on the right and a painting that Picasso does in response to such work. When he eventually returns to his studio months later, he's able to complete the portrait from memory. And when the painting of Gertrude is finally revealed to the public, there is great scrutiny and criticism that the portrait doesn't look like her, whereas Picasso responds, in the end, she will manage to look just like the painting. Picasso went through a lot of phases like the blue period, the rose period. In many of his Cubist works, Picasso reduced his subjects to basic geometrical shapes. So you can start to see how he's breaking down his pictures into different facets and plains. In the period following the upheaval of World War I, Picasso painted Guernica, a protest against the barbaric air raid against the Basque village during the Spanish Civil War. It is a mural-sized oil painting that many critics consider to be one of the most moving and powerful anti-war paintings in history. Guernica portrays the horrors of war at the fullest and shows the suffering of people wrenched by violence and chaos. On April 26 of 1937, the fascist leader Franco ordered the Nazis to drop bombs over the small town of Guernica, and he deliberately wanted this to take place during market day, which meant that they were targeting women and children, and this painting quickly gained monumental status, becoming an embodiment of peace. There is another well-known story regarding Picasso and this particular painting. During the Second World War, Picasso remained in Paris while the Germans occupied the city and was often harassed by the Gestapo. During one such search of his apartment, an officer saw a drawing of his painting and asked Picasso, "Did you do that?" To which Picasso replied, "No, you did." So Picasso is one of the greatest influencers in the 20th century, and there is a famous anecdote of him, which is not very historical, but still gets us to think about a few things. Anyway, he goes to a restaurant with a bunch of his friends, and they're consuming a whole lot and enjoying their meal. And at the end of the meal, Picasso is feeling really good. And so he tells his friends, "Hey guys, this one's on me." And he motions the waiter over and says, "Hey waiter, give me a napkin and a pen." And the waiter brings a napkin and a pen over, and Picasso spends about a minute on the drawing and hands it to the waiter saying, "This should pay for our meal." And the waiter looks at the napkin and says, "But Mr. Picasso, you forgot to sign this drawing." And Picasso says, "I said I would pay for dinner, not buy out your restaurant." So this is a silly anecdote, of course, but it gets you to start thinking about the value of art and the value of the artist associated with the artwork, and if it's relevant or not. Speaking of names, here are some anonymous works of art. What's art history without taking a little bit of time to talk about cave paintings? Art came long before language, and the cave paintings of Western Europe are one of the first things you will encounter in any general art history survey class. For the longest time, it was thought that these paintings originated in Lascaux, France, 17,000 years ago, and Altamira, Spain, 36,000 years ago. Images of bison and the woolly mammoth, horses, lions, and deer are either painted on and or engraved into the uneven walls of the cave. They are often painted using mineral pigments. Most common prehistoric pigments are black, made from charcoal, and red ochre, made from hematite. And these are cave paintings from Altamira, Spain, which are known for the many bisons depicted on their walls. Bison, more bison. So more than 400 caves filled with art has been discovered globally so far, and for the longest time it was assumed that modern human intelligence rose exclusively in Europe, and that because the creative explosion was thought to be unique to Europe, it was assumed that things did not develop in other parts of the globe until much, much later. But most recently, scientists have identified some of the oldest cave paintings of these hand stencils, as well as animal paintings, to have been created by humans in Sulawesi, Indonesia. This most recent discovery in Indonesia is fascinating in that it has altered our Eurocentric understanding of history. The oldest painting identified in these Indonesian caves are thought to be more than 40,000 years old. Anyway, we have always imagined that the painter of most cave paintings did not call those images art in the sense that we do. Our modern notion of what art is came much, much later in the late 19th century, but we won't get into that right now. When an animal is depicted in a cave painting, we had speculated that the drawn image functioned as a kind of picture magic that symbolically captured the animal necessary for the survival of the old Stone Age hunters who created that image. So it was a ritualistic or even a spiritual event. But these most recent paintings in Indonesia are not only the oldest paintings now known to us, but they depict scenes of animals being hunted by humanoid figures, humans with animal features like beaks and tails. So this new knowledge has given researchers a new understanding of the development of human cognition, more specifically in terms of the moment where modern humans became, for the lack of better word, woke to self-awareness and creativity, two elements needed to interpret creatures and objects from the real world into the abstract. So these paintings in Asia has actually become our oldest known example of a story told through art and has rewritten our history and our understanding of visual storytelling and forced us to abandon our long-held assumption that modern human intelligence rose exclusively in Europe. Our modern and Western concept of art began to take shape during the 19th century, most likely when photography became widespread and art became less of a means to document and more of a space to express and to experiment. Through certain times and cultures, art was a way for people to record visual data, or it was a means of storytelling. Or art was an effective way of delivering information to the mass populace. Art within churches and cathedrals were created to illustrate the teachings of the Bible for a largely illiterate population. So, with the camera that could document things more accurately and effortlessly than most paintings could, there was no longer a need for replication. Picasso said that the purpose of art is to wash away the dust off our everyday souls. But really, art and our ability to think of abstract concepts is what distinguishes our species from others. And every work of art is an expression of its culture and depends on when and where the artwork had emerged. It also depends on the maker, the artist. The medium or what the artwork is made out of also contributes to how you interpret the artwork or how you make meaning of it. In other words, any single product, any single work of art is immensely complex and loaded with information. Just in the way that the recent discovery of the Indonesian cave paintings have altered our understanding of the origins of art, or how even in the short 90 years since Constantin Brancusi first conceived Bird in Space, our understanding of what constitutes an artwork, and for that matter, who can occupy the role of the artist, has become much broader and more expansive. Art history textbooks used to revolve around a very Western viewpoint. When I was in college, the textbook for my art history 101 class during my freshman year was very dense. There were 2 giant volumes, and about 96% of it covered Western art history, and about 4% covered art from Asia and Africa and South America and the whole rest of the world. But in reality, everything that has been created by mankind is worth looking at and learning about. And fortunately, our knowledge of human history is constantly shifting and being corrected. As the world is becoming smaller, our knowledge base is expanding, and the voices that get to tell the story of art is really diversifying and intensifying. I'm sure you guys have been told this, but I think that you're lucky in that you are living in the age of social and political change and awareness and accountability. Whole worlds and cultures are also accessible to you with a simple click of a button. And I think you are the generation that is going to really impact and bring change to many things, including the trend of the history of art, the trend of the world history being told from a singular viewpoint. I had a mentor who advised me that you really do have to be careful, suspicious even of people who spend a great deal of time talking about art. He's a museum educator, and whenever he's in the museum, he has to remind people often that the thing they should not do is to read the label, at least to not read it so closely. And people ask him, well, why not? And his answer is because the artist didn't write the label for the work. They are words not about the work, but the speculated or assumed idea of the work. So anytime people talk about art history, you should take it with a grain of salt, or with a grain of suspicion, including this talk. And keep in mind things like, how do you recognize what is and is not a work of art? Does an artwork's title help you interpret an artwork? Is a title necessary to give the artwork meaning? Does the name of the artist give meaning to the work or value to the work? The history of art is not linear, nor is it exclusive to one part of the globe. It is a complex, dimensional, and expansive web. And hopefully, soon enough, it will become a history of equality and diversity of the entire globe. So this is just the first little talk out of a series of 3. When we see each other next year, there'll be more ideas to discuss and talk about. And most of the segment of this lecture was ironically about a very specific group of artists, but hopefully in showing you a stream of artwork in the last segment, there are some images that may have caught your eye. If that is the case, look those artists up, research them, learn about them, and when the world opens up again, when we get through to the other side of this pandemic, I hope that you're able to create opportunities for yourself to see some of the work in real life. Um, your, your education is a job of a lifetime, so thanks for tuning in. I'm glad we had a chance to touch base, although 4 weeks together in Fredonia, New York would have been a much favorable option, but best of luck, and we will see you on the other side of this.